What does the phrase mystery dungeon mean to you? If you're a gamer outside of Japan, the unfortunate answer to that is probably, I don't know, those weird Pokemon spin offs? And while you wouldn't technically be wrong, the truth of the matter is that the Mystery Dungeon series is an innovative action RPG staple that was pioneering the whole roguelike thing 20 years ahead of the genre's recent boom in popularity, with procedurally generated dungeon crawling and punishing permadeath being at the core of its identity. In fact, some of the games in the series are among the highest rated games of all time by Japanese publications like Famitsu, and the series is still running strong to this day. Despite this, and despite its many entries attached to behemoth IP like Pokemon and Final Fantasy, the series was never able to fully escape the shadow of its dire localization history, with most of the formative entries being stranded in the Japanese market permanently. However, thanks to the magic of, or rather, effort of, fan translations, those of us with a curious nature are able to enjoy the earlier games now. And upon doing so, you'll be stumbling into a treasure trove of great games and fascinating, albeit confusing, history, including what I believe to be one of the greatest games ever made. The franchise's debut entry, Torneko's Great Adventure, Mystery Dungeon. Released in 1993 as a Super Famicom exclusive, Mystery Dungeon begins here, and though the game's title doesn't explicitly state it, the game is a spin-off of developer Chunsoft's prior creation, a little series you may have heard of called Dragon Quest. Chunsoft developed the first 5 Dragon Quest entries, drawing inspiration from early PC-based role-playing games such as Wizardry, and distilling the ingredients down for a wider console audience to create the turn-based JRPG formula as we know it today. Seemingly unsatisfied with this ridiculous stroke of genius, Chunsoft dared to make lightning strike twice, with Mystery Dungeon once again pulling from PC classics like Rogue and NetHack to create something entirely new. Ultimately, the connection to Dragon Quest isn't all that important outside of knowing that the game's protagonist, Torneko Taloon, was a fan-favorite party member in Dragon Quest IV, and a very wise pick for a mascot for Chunsoft's new venture. You see, Torneko is an endearingly average everyman, a simple shopkeeper who wants to provide for his family through the not-so-glamorous trials and tribulations of small business ownership. In Dragon Quest IV, you spend an entire chapter of the game playing as him, in an extremely ahead-of-its-time subversion of the RPG shopkeeper trope. Rather than submitting him to a passive role typical of this archetype, Dragon Quest IV allows Torneko to be a hero all his own. He's eventually sucked into the larger-than-life adventure of the game, partly in pursuit of valuable treasures to sell back at his shop, but mostly because he's just that solid of a dude. He's a lovable underdog if I've ever seen one, and it sets the stage perfectly for the plot of Mystery Dungeon. The game begins with an absolutely adorable storybook recap of Torneko's journey thus far, complete with NES throwback graphical stylings. Don't mind the weirdness with the text here, it's because of the fan translation, and it isn't like this for the duration of the actual game. Torneko hears of a mysterious dungeon in a faraway land filled with untold treasures, and yearns to explore it. But he's also worried about his family. Like I said, he's a great guy. And luckily for him, his wife is a total sweetheart as well, and supports his dreams fully. So, the couple, along with their young son, set off across many seas and eventually reach their destination. Quick note. Torneko's wife is supposed to be named Tessie, and his son is supposed to be named Tipper, but due to various translation complexities and confusions, they end up being called Nene and Popolo respectively here. Similarly, everyone refers to Torneko by what should be his last name, Taloon. It's not a huge deal, but I thought I'd mention it for clarity. The family, whatever their names are, decide to let the child name their new home, which means you as the player get to name it. I went the creative route and named it Home. Nene and Popolo will handle setting up their new shop/residence, and Torneko will go introduce himself to the king of this new land. While the king is happy upon hearing of the commercial convenience that Torneko's new shop will provide to his people, he's more skeptical about the prospect of Torneko entering the mysterious dungeon. No one who goes into it seems to live to tell the tale, and he asks if Torneko is afraid, which, of course, he's not. The king says that legend has foretold of a special adventurer like Torneko, but stresses the strange, ever-changing properties of the dungeon, hinting at the basic gameplay loop of the game to come. After one last confirmation that we really do mean business, the king folds and decides that if we're able to retrieve his jewel chest from the smaller trial dungeon, he'll allow us to explore the proper mystery dungeon in all of its danger and mystery. We agree and finally assume control of our hero. Make sure to talk to everyone else in the throne room here for some basic tips about the gameplay. They're quite the yappers, but it's all useful stuff. Exit when you're ready, and our adventure begins. Now, the game is pretty open-ended from here, and every player's experience is going to vary wildly, but it's a good opportunity to pause and talk about the basic mechanics. The first thing you'll notice is that the game is entirely grid-based. One press of the D-pad equals one square moved in that respective direction. You can also move diagonally or zip around multiple squares quickly by holding down the B button, but be careful, because the game is also turn-based. Every action you take, whether moving one square, attacking, or using an item, constitutes one turn, and rather than the back-and-forth turn structure of a traditional JRPG, turns are taken by all active participants simultaneously, at least when it comes to movement. If you move one square, all enemies will also get to move one square at the same time. This was actually brilliantly telegraphed to players back in the King's throne room, via this old man who's frittering around the room. It's a minor detail, but it's a good example of exposing players to a mechanic in a safe environment first, teaching them the rules of the game, if even just subconsciously. All of the game's action is also displayed in a more simplified form on the very useful minimap, which will give you an idea of what's generally going on in any part of the current floor that you've already explored. You can also attack in 8 directions, the power of which will be determined by your strength stat and the attack stat of your currently equipped weapon, if any. Defeating enemies will earn XP and over time level you up, increasing your maximum HP and strength. If your HP hits 0, you're incapacitated and have to start over fresh from floor 1, with Torneko's level also reset to 1. It's all pretty basic at first, but the wild card here is the randomization. Every layout of every floor of the dungeon, trial or otherwise, is random each time you enter it. This includes not only the basic layout, but also the placement of monsters, items, traps, and the stairways that progress you to the next floor. It's not entirely random in the sense that more powerful monsters and such will be restricted to deeper floors of the dungeon. You won't ever, for example, enter the first floor and encounter a monster appropriate for the final floor or anything of that sort. However, it's random enough to be entirely unpredictable and to keep you on your toes, often putting you into compromising and sometimes outright frustrating situations. But it's all part of the game. In addition to your HP, which gradually refills itself as you perform safe actions such as moving, you'll have to keep an eye on Torneko's level of hunger, which inversely will gradually wear away as you act, ultimately culminating with each step doing damage to you if you're starving to death. This is an essential component of the game's tension. You see, monsters will slowly but continuously spawn into each floor at random locations as you explore, making intentionally sandbagging behind and farming XP before progressing to the next floor a viable and sometimes necessary strategy. However, the hunger meter offsets this, as a constant pressure to keep moving. While bread is an item that can be eaten to refill your belly, there's no guarantee that a fresh loaf will be waiting for you around the next corner, or even the one after that. So lollygagging around in one spot for too long can often be a one-way ticket to starvation. It's this exact push and pull, risk and reward, that makes every run exhilarating even once you've already familiarized yourself with the dungeon's possible contents, of which there are many. In addition to the aforementioned loaves of bread, you can find swords to raise your attack power, shields to raise your defense against incoming attacks, arrows to fire at enemies from a distance, and an absolute smorgasbord of herbs, scrolls, staves, and rings to eat, read, swing, and wear, respectively, with a ridiculous variety of effects and uses. From area of effect attacks, to upgrading the level of your currently equipped equipment, to warping you to a random spot on the current floor to squeeze out of a sticky situation, to imbuing enemies with detrimental status effects like confusion or sleepiness, to curing Torneko of those same status effects. There's over 50 different items to find and traps to accidentally step into, and I can't go over the intricacies of every single one, especially since I think you should probably play this game and allow yourself the fun of discovering them for yourself. However, some are more vital than others, and I will be mentioning them as needed, so don't worry. Just know, there's quite the sandbox here, and let's not forget that Torneko can only carry so much. Inventory space is limited, and you will run out of it, assuming that you survive long enough for this to become an issue. Again, like hunger, this creates another layer of risk versus reward. Drop an item now in favor of another one, and there's no guarantee that the one you just dropped won't be situationally useful a floor or two deeper into the dungeon. The stakes of this are raised even higher when you realize that if you're lucky enough to get an outside scroll, which will safely warp Torneko out of the dungeon, effectively bailing on your current run, you can store the items you escape with in the vault to help start off future runs on a good foot. Alternatively, you can sell the items to make extra gold to put towards renovating Torneko's shop, which provides a sense of progression to break things up. Ultimately, Mystery Dungeon is a game of decisions. Specifically, it's a game of a million semi-informed micro-decisions that cascade outward into complex emergent situations that become the short-term narrative of each run through the dungeon. Chunsoft does a really great job of acting as the omnipresent, invisible dungeon master, engineering interesting situations through the way the mechanics all interact with one another. But wait, I'll bloviate about how great the game is in general in a little bit. I almost forgot. We haven't even gotten to the actual mysterious dungeon yet. So, assuming you can come to grips with the basics, you shouldn't have too much trouble navigating to the 10th floor of the trial dungeon and grabbing that jewel box that the king requested. Once you pick up a dungeon's special treasure, like the jewel box here, you'll be able to ascend back upwards the way you came in an attempt to escape with your haul, assuming you don't have an aforementioned outside scroll to warp instantly to safety. Ascending towards the surface in a mad dash is extremely cathartic. Of course, the floors now get easier as you ascend back up them, and your fully leveled up character is way strong, with the measly early floors of the dungeon feeling like a triumphant victory lap after the tense crawl to its depths. Escape successfully, give the king back his jewel box, and he has no choice but to abide Torneko's wish to explore the real mysterious dungeon, an absolute hellhole roughly 3 times the depth of the trial dungeon, and where you'll spend the bulk of the game's runtime. The mysterious dungeon holds within its depths the legendary treasure Torneko was after all along, with it usually spawning between floor 26 and 28. But don't get too excited yet, as you're more than likely going to endure dozens of failed runs along the way. And this is the core of the game. You'll enter the dungeon, be subject to equal helpings of hilarity and despair, sometimes get flattened and tossed out like a chump, and sometimes escape with gold and goods. All the while, you'll be sharpening your skills and learning the ins and outs of the systems. You can talk to a cast of friendly villagers, invest in shop upgrades with gold you scrounge out of the dungeon, and most importantly, check in with Nene before your daily attempt at the dungeon for a packed lunch, a lovingly crafted item that serves as your one guaranteed bit of help during each delve into the depths below. And as you try, fail, and try again to best the mysterious dungeon, the game's genius on a mechanical level will start to reveal itself. The dungeon crawling antics could seem repetitive to some, but what's interesting about it is how it serves as an amalgamation of so many other role-playing subgenres and tropes. Whether it's bottlenecking enemies by positioning yourself inside of a narrow hallway to avoid being surrounded and overwhelmed by them, diagonally zigzagging to weave outside the line of fire of ranged enemy attacks, or carefully calculating the number of movements it will take to retreat from a situation entirely, the grid-based positioning calls back heavily to strategy RPGs like Fire Emblem or Famicom Wars, or even traditional board games before that. The status effects, inventory management, and risk-reward tension of when to push forward and when to bail back to safety has echoes of JRPGs like the very Dragon Quest series it borrows its protagonist from. Toss in the procedural generation of the aforementioned Rogue and NetHack, and it all comes full circle into something blissful and unique. It's deeply turn-based and rooted in strategy and careful planning, but presented in an immediate and action-oriented style that really sets it apart. In a different timeline, the term action RPG would be synonymous with something like this game, at least for my taste. Even your quote-unquote build will vary with each run, with it naturally forming from the types of items and equipment you run across. One run, you'll be a glass cannon with a powerful sword but without a shield. The next run, you'll be short a weapon and have to rely on confusing enemies with scrolls and slipping past them without fighting at all. You might find poisonous grass that's useless to you and throw it at an enemy to inflict them with its effects instead. You'll put on a piece of equipment only to find out it's cursed and you're stuck with it until you find an uncursed scroll to remove it. Staves and rings have to be identified with the appropriately named identify scrolls before you even know what they do, and inevitably, you'll find yourself in a situation where you're cornered, and out of desperation, you'll swing a staff at an enemy without any idea of what effect it's actually going to have. You'll be down to your last bit of HP and an enemy will miss their killing blow, letting you squeeze through to fight for another moment. You'll have the best shield and equipment you've ever found and be riding high until you realize you haven't found a loaf of bread in forever and unceremoniously starve to death. Then on the next run, you'll be overflowing with food but low on HP and you'll run in place by holding A and B to burn away some of your fullness in exchange for a speedy HP recovery. You'll be blinded, confused, warped, nerfed, de-leveled, and be able to do all of that back in return to the various enemies you encounter along the way, each with their own traits, movement patterns, and abilities. It's chaotic, sometimes unfair, but always fun. And with enough persistence, you will eventually make it to the heart of the dungeon where that treasure lies in wait. And hey, what is the treasure anyway? After all this trouble, it better be something good, right? Well, fret not. By the time I first laid my eyes upon the treasure itself, this game had already cemented itself as a classic action RPG, a must-play Super Nintendo game, and a mildly visionary game given how close it resembles the structure and tone of many of today's indie roguelikes. However, upon actually picking up the treasure and realizing what it was, the game became so much more. You grab the treasure and it's happiness, complete with the pitch-perfect description, "This has been sought after for a long time." Now, not to be overdramatic, but this genuinely floored me. If I had to count on my fingers the most impactful gaming moments to me personally, this would definitively make the list, even if I only had one hand. This little message flipped a switch for me where what I had previously been experiencing throughout the entire game suddenly took on an entire new layer of meaning. I understood deeply and intuitively exactly what the game was trying to say. As I thought back on all of my time with the game thus far, it suddenly seemed so clear. The mysterious dungeon is an allegory for life itself. Stick with me. We all have goals or dreams, at least vague aspirations and desires. And like Torneko setting off into the dungeon, we slowly carve a path towards them day by day. We can't often predict, much less control, the obstacles that will face us along the way. It can be scary and uncertain, and it almost never turns out exactly the way we envisioned. While sometimes things line up perfectly and we get just the things we need, other times the path can seem like it was specifically designed to see us fail. Sometimes we're well prepared and seemingly over-equipped for the situation at hand, only to be blindsided by something we never saw coming. Other times, when it seems all hope is lost and failure is imminent, the stars align and we just barely prevail by the skin of our teeth. Sometimes we're able to bring something tangible back from our adventures to help us materially the next time around. And other times we fall flat on our faces and are stripped of everything. Well, almost everything, because even the most astounding failures do provide the most valuable thing of all: insight. While we can't control what lies ahead, we can always learn from our mistakes. Detaching ourselves from the short-term outcomes and looking at the big picture shows us a far more accurate truth: that every perceived failure along the way was merely a step towards eventual victory. Success is never certain, but it is always possible. Maybe not immediately or even soon, but with a little bit of thinking and oftentimes a fair share of luck, anything is possible, eventually. Whether it takes 5 tries or 10 or 2,378 is ultimately irrelevant. What matters is that we continue to try. Not because it's easy, and not for earthly pleasures like wealth and power, but because dreaming and having the determination and will to pursue those dreams, even in the face of certain doom, is ultimately what it means to live. And perhaps, if you're really lucky, you'll have a few loved ones to share the happiness with when all is said and done. This isn't the end of Torneko's tale entirely. Not only does the game have an even harder bonus dungeon waiting in its post-game, but it would see 2 full-fledged sequels, and the Mystery Dungeon series would eventually spawn entries based on everything from Twinbee to Gundam to an entirely unique cast of characters all its own. However, Torneko's great adventure stands alone as not only the origin of it all, but a Trojan horse of wisdom, and a timeless testament to the unique kinds of storytelling that only video games are capable of. While its story may seem quaint when simply recounted verbally, like all true wisdom, the bit of it found in this game can't simply be taught or told. Rather, it must be learned through first-hand experience. Because what a simple recital of the major plot points could never truly capture are the most important things of all: the unique twists and turns along the way, serendipitous or otherwise, that make the journey towards any treasure worth taking. Please play this game. And, as unfortunately obscure as he may be, put some respect on my man's name. Torneko is a hero. And I am Backseat Sakurai. I'll catch you later.